VAMP, Chapter 11. That was delicious, I said, patting my belly and leaning back in my chair at Aiden's table. I'm glad you liked it. How can you even eat food? He asked. I don't know the exact science of how it all works, but from what I gather, my body just absorbs it. It does the same thing with alcohol. I'm technically never full and never drunk, or stoned. When are we going out fishing again? I asked. 2 weeks, I think. Why? I have to go to state for a few days. Maybe you and your dad should go and take a nice little vacation somewhere? Where are you going? I have to take a friend to Minnesota to meet someone. He's just found out he's a werewolf, and he needs some training. I know a guy there who can help him. Oh, said Aiden as he ran one of his hands through his hair. It was down right now, and a big mess of waves. I wanted to run my fingers through it. It's still hard for you to wrap your mind around, isn't it? A little bit. It's weird that the stories aren't just stories. Well, every story has to start from something. I suppose, he said, leaning down to give me a kiss. How long are you going to be gone for? I'll probably be back in 3 days. I'm really just like bringing this kid to camp, I said, with quotation marks. Bummer. You should really take the opportunity to go relax for a few days with your dad, I said, lightly poking him in the stomach. You keep saying that. Would you not want me home alone or something? He asked, looking down at me. Then a serious look overcame his face when he remembered yesterday. I think it just might be safer, I said, leaving it at that. I have to go home and pack a few things, then pick up Buddy, and we'll be heading out. Aiden walked over to where I was standing, put his hands on the sides of my face, and gave me a long, passionate kiss. Hurry back, he said, smiling after we parted. I will. I'll call you before we leave, I said, returning the smile and walking out the door. When I got into my Jeep, I phoned Buddy to let him know I'd be there in about a half hour to pick him up. All I needed to grab was my jacket, boots, jeans, and sweatshirts, and then the basic necessities. When I got home, I ran upstairs and threw everything into my duffel bag. I made sure all of the windows and doors were locked, and then headed to the hotel where Buddy was staying. He was waiting for me in the lobby and came right out when he saw me pull up. Hey, Gretch, he said, waving. Hey, Buddy, I said, unlocking the door so he could throw his stuff inside. He threw the stuff in the back, climbed into the passenger seat, and buckled up. Did you read the books? I asked. Yes, I did. Very interesting stuff. I learned a lot. Did you practice shifting? I went out to the woods. I took one of the books with me that explained how to allow you to shift, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't change. He was shaking his head and looking down at his hands in his lap. I called Aiden when we were driving to the airport. He and his dad had actually decided to take his dad's smaller boat out for a salmon fishing trip for the next few days. They were getting ready to load the boat, so I wished them luck. Once we disconnected, I felt a sense of ease roll over me. At least it was one thing I wouldn't have to worry about over the next few days. Then I texted Asher to let him know of our impending arrival. By late afternoon, we had landed in Minnesota. I rented a car, and I plugged in Asher's address into the GPS. Asher lived out in the country. He had a nice 2-story farmhouse in the middle of his land with a barn and a huge garage at the edge of the woods. I could see Asher coming out of his house as we pulled up the driveway. There he is, I said. Hey, Gretch, said Ash as he spit some chew on the ground. Well, I see you're still chewing. Yeah, well, I see you're still breathing. And it's not like it's gonna kill me, Mother, Asher replied sarcastically. Old habits die hard, I shrugged. We laughed and hugged. Witty banter had always been our way of communicating. So, who's this? Asher asked as he looked over at Buddy. This is Buddy, I said, gesturing towards him. Buddy stayed silent, but nodded in Asher's direction. I really appreciate you helping him out, I said. Yeah, you know me. All about the charity cases, said Asher. I really appreciate this, said Buddy as he extended his hand towards Asher's. Asher just stared at Buddy's hand and then said, Come on to the barn, as he turned and started walking. We're starting now? Asked Buddy. There were beads of sweat coming down his forehead, and we were standing in an open field in Minnesota, in October, with frost on the ground. Yeah, it's going to be sunset pretty soon, said Asher. You'll be fine, I said as I patted him on the back. We followed Asher to the barn. It was open, with big loft upstairs. However, It was in relatively good shape, not like one of those barns you saw that was falling apart. "Come over here so I can get a look at you," said Asher. I sat on an old back seat from a 1950s car that Asher must have been rebuilding. "When was the last time you changed?" "I'm not sure. I don't remember," said Buddy. "What do you mean you don't remember?" "I can't change myself. It just happens. And I don't remember anything from when I'm in my other form," Buddy said, looking down at his feet. "Well, you're in luck. There's a full moon tonight. You'll have no choice but to shift. And my guess is that all the other times you've shifted has been because of the full moon or something triggered you. But don't worry, I'll be with you tonight and I'll be able to communicate with you," said Asher. "Okay, we are going to take you outside and we will let you shift from the moon. Pay attention to what's going on in your body. If you can remember what it feels like, eventually you'll be able to control it yourself," Asher said. We made our way out of the barn. Asher stopped at the door and let Buddy go outside. The sun had gone down a few minutes ago, and we could see the top of the full moon rising above the trees. "How long will this take?" I asked. Asher poked his head out from behind the door. He was hiding behind the wall so that the moon wouldn't change him. "Any minute now. It's a fast reaction with the moon." Just then, a sound jerked my head in Buddy's direction. Buddy was on the ground, and I could see him starting to tremble. Then he screamed in pain, and right before my eyes, his bones started bending and breaking. It started from his back, and it moved through his whole body. His clothes began to rip off and fall to the ground. He got on all fours and grew taller. And lastly, a thick coat of white fur sprang out of his skin and covered his whole body. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. I'd never seen a werewolf change in front of me before. "Whoa," I heard Asher say next to me. "He's beautiful," I said quietly and half to myself. Buddy was fully shifted now, and standing in front of us was a gorgeous white wolf with huge black eyes. Asher was communicating with him telepathically, making sure to only peek out from behind the doorway. He told him to sit, and Buddy followed. "He's so white," I said, looking up at Asher. "There's not even one strand of pepper in all that salt." "I know. Normally we're shades of blacks, browns, reds, grays. He's pure white. It's really rare," he said, not breaking his gaze from Buddy. Buddy looked at me and turned his head to the side like a dog who's confused about what's going on. I had to laugh. "He seems rather calm," I said. "That's because I'm telling him to be. He says he feels better this time, like he has more control." "Maybe that's because you're in his brain," I said. "I'm going to go out with him in the woods for a little bit. You want to ride along?" Asher asked. "Can I do that?" "Yeah, just hop on my back after I change," Asher said. He took a few steps away from me, closed his eyes, and let himself shift inside the barn. He could do it faster than Buddy did, and I wondered to myself if practice had anything to do with it. He walked over to me in his wolf form, and I climbed up and hung onto his fur at the back of his neck. Asher had black and gray fur. It was thick, coarse hair. I ran my fingers through it to take out some snarls. "You need to be brushed," I said out loud, which Asher replied with a very aggressive shaking of his head, which I took to mean no. He looked back at Buddy and motioned with his head for him to follow. We headed for the forest line, and then they took off running. Asher was fast, but I was surprised to see that Buddy was faster. I could tell they loved this. There was a certain freedom I could feel coming from them. It was the joy of running through the woods, not a care or worry in the world. What's there to worry about when you're basically at the top of the food chain? All of a sudden, Buddy stopped mid-run and looked off in the distance. I looked over Asher's head and saw a deer about 100 yards away. Asher looked over at Buddy. Buddy sank low to the ground and did a quiet crawl until he had a better view of the deer. He laid low for a second and then in an instant was sprinting towards the animal. I heard a growl and a cry of pain, and then silence. I climbed off Asher's back when I saw Buddy return with the animal in his teeth. Then the two of them went to town on it. I had to say I was impressed. Buddy seemed to be doing really well. Asher turned his head back to look at me, and then looked at the deer. I realized he was asking me if I wanted any. No thanks, you two enjoy, I said, smiling. He licked his chops and went back to his meal. When they finished, we headed back to the barn. Asher dropped me off at the edge of the woods and nudged me forward with his nose, telling me to get in the house. I started walking, and then I turned around and they were gone, heading back into the woods to enjoy the rest of their night. The moon was out now. It was a perfectly clear night sky filled with stars. I walked into the house and went upstairs to the guest room I was staying in to change into some sweats. What was I going to do to keep myself occupied? I thought. I went downstairs to the living room and turned on Asher's TV. He had Netflix, so I crawled on the couch, got comfy, and flipped through the instant movies and shows. I watched it all through the night until I saw some light start to peek through the windows and I heard the boys coming back from their long evening out. I could hear them heading to the barn, and Asher saying he had some extra clothes stashed in there for them to change into. I met them on the steps of the house a few minutes later. How did it go? Buddy ran over to me. It was amazing, he exclaimed. I never felt more powerful, and I remember everything. I looked at the two of them. They were both over 6 feet tall and pretty well built. That didn't surprise me, though. Out of all of the wares I'd ever met, not one of them had been out of shape. They were both shirtless and wearing athletic shorts. I had to smile as well because they were both covered in mud and sweat and had leaves sticking out of their hair. Well, I'm glad. Any ideas why you remember this time? I said, looking from Buddy to Asher. The only thing I can think of is that it's because I was here to talk him through it and explain what to do and what was going on, said Asher, shrugging his shoulders. I remember the first time I shifted. I was alone too, and it would have been nice to have someone with me to explain everything. Also, just being around another one of our kind can establish a sense of calmness and comfort. But he got to meet a few of the other guys last night too, said Asher. Yeah, a pretty nice group of guys, actually, Buddy added in. He looked tired but alive. There was a light in his eyes and a small smile stuck on his lips. He seemed so much more settled. That's great, Buddy. I knew this would be the best place to help you. I paused for a moment, preparing to change the subject. I was wondering if you two might help me with something. Sure, you don't have to ask me twice, said Buddy. What is it? Asked Asher. Well, it's kind of hard to explain. I'm not even sure myself what's going on. How about you guys go get cleaned up and get some rest, and later tonight I'll explain everything, and we can try and figure it out. Sounds good, said Asher and Buddy in unison. I kept myself occupied while the boys cleaned themselves up and slept for a few hours. When they woke up, I was in the kitchen making dinner for everyone. Smells delicious, said Asher as he ran his hand over the top of my head, messing up my hair. I glared at him and he laughed. Thanks, I said as I pulled some rolls out of the oven. So what's up? Asked Buddy. I double-checked the stuff I had cooking on the stove and turned around to face them. Something weird happened to me with Aiden. It's happened twice now, and I don't understand what's going on. Okay, they said together. I think I can suck the heat out of his body, and I need one of you to let me try it on you. What do you mean by sucking the heat out of his body? Asked Buddy. He held my hand in the restaurant on our first date. While he was holding my hand, I could feel heat coming through my fingers and slowly moving up my arm. The second time it happened, we were in the parking lot, and I had my hand on his chest, and once again I could feel the heat moving through my arm and start circulating through my body. But I don't know if this could be dangerous because he ended up getting the chills from it, I said as I turned around to stir some of the stuff on the stove. That's really interesting, said Asher. I don't think I've ever heard of that one. It must be a quality specifically tied to you. But what's the point of it? I asked, tossing my hands in the air. Let's give this a try, said Buddy as he threw his arm down in front of me. I looked over at Asher and he shrugged as to say, what the hell? I looked back at Buddy and said, you need to tell me everything you feel. If there is any pain, dizziness, sickness, anything at all, I need you to be very vocal. Not a problem, he said. I looked down at Buddy's arm. I held onto his arm right above his wrist and focused on the heat in his skin. I could feel the blood pumping through his veins. I focused on the heat moving from his body into my own. I closed my eyes and visualized what was going on under our skin. When I felt the heat reach my shoulder, I opened my eyes and looked at Buddy. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "I can feel you taking the heat from me, but I'm not getting any shivers like you said Aiden got." "Well, I'll hang on a little longer. You have a higher temp than most people anyway," I said. The three of us sat there in silence, just watching our arms. I could feel the heat filling up the upper half of my body. Everything from my waist up was warm. "Feel me," I said, looking at Asher. He reached his hand over and grabbed my upper arm. "You're warm," he said, his eyes growing huge. "This is insane." A few more minutes passed, and I could feel the warmness going down to my legs and my feet. I closed my eyes and focused on the heat. I imagined the liquid fire coursing through my veins and arteries, reaching every part of my body. I also focused on absorbing the heat faster. It was at this point that Buddy spoke up. "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm starting to feel a little weird. Like it's spring in here or something. Look, I have goose pimples," he said as he lifted his other arm. "Do you think you can handle it a little longer?" I asked. "Yeah, no problem." We sat listening to the second hand move on the clock above us. Tick, tick, tick. Eventually, another minute had passed, and then another 2 minutes. Then Buddy spoke up again. "I'm feeling dizzy. I feel like you're taking my energy now." I looked over at Asher, who was looking at me and Buddy quizzically. "Maybe you can suck more than heat out of a person?" he said quietly. "I'm getting tired," said Buddy. I looked up at his face. He was turning white, and you could see dark circles forming under his eyes. I let go of his arm. "I think you could have killed me. Eventually," he said. Asher nodded his head in agreement. I shook my head. "No, this can't be possible. I can't absorb life out of someone." "Gretchen, look at the three of us," said Asher. "We are sort of proof that nothing is impossible. I think because Buddy is a werewolf, he's able to hang on longer than a human would be able to. A human might be dead in the time it took Buddy to feel tired." "What are you feeling?" asked Buddy. "What are you feeling?" asked Buddy. I leaned back in my chair. I hadn't thought about how it made me feel too much. When I focused on myself, I was still warmer than usual. The coldness hasn't come back yet. I feel warmer, I said. "Do you feel stronger?" asked Asher. I couldn't really tell. Mostly I felt the same, so I just shook my head no. "Well, I know one way to figure it all out," said Asher. I looked at him and raised an eyebrow. "Let's go find a guy and see if you can kill him." "We can just find a homeless guy or something," said Asher. "Winter is almost here. They'll be looking for a way out soon." I stared down at the table for a moment, then looked up at and met Asher's gaze. It really was the only way I could think of to test out this power. "I don't want to kill an innocent homeless man. I'd rather kill someone who deserves it," I said as I strummed my fingers on the table. "I'm sure we can find someone who fits that requirement." That night we drove to a bigger city a couple hours away from Asher's house. We thought it would be best to choose a place where no one would recognize us. We had only been in the bar for about 10 minutes when I saw my target. He was sitting at a table in the corner with a woman who looked like she'd been crying. I could tell they were having an argument, and then all of a sudden he stood up, grabbed her arm, and dragged her outside. I tapped Asher's arm and they followed me outside. I found the man standing in an alley with his girlfriend. He had her back pushed up against the side of a building. He had his hands around her arms, and his grasp was so tight I could see his fingertips digging into her skin. She was crying and trying to look down at the ground, but he just kept yelling at her. I nudged Asher's side, and his gaze followed mine to the dark alley. "Perfect," he whispered. "I'll take care of this," I said to the boys. "Can you guys keep a lookout for me?" They both nodded, and I turned away from them and headed down the alley. The man and woman were about 25 feet away from me, and they were standing behind a dumpster which reeked of fish. I kept quiet so they wouldn't hear me approach them. I could see tears streaming down the woman's face as the man held her chin with his fingers and continued to yell at her. Apparently, he was mad at her for flirting with the bartender. I could feel my muscles contracting, like they knew that they would be getting into a fight, and I could feel my strength and anger growing. "What's going on down here?" I asked forcefully. Both their heads snapped in my direction. "Nothing that concerns you. Leave us alone," spat the man. He never even removed his hand from her chin, but when I looked into the girl's eyes, I could see she was pleading with me to do something. So I did. In a flash, I had moved behind the man and had bent the hand that was holding her face backwards behind his body. And I didn't stop pulling until I felt his shoulder rip out of the socket. He dropped to the ground, gasping and trying to catch his breath in pain. The young woman was standing flat against the wall, and her eyes looked like they were going to pop out of her skull. "Do you want me to kill him?" I asked her. The shocked look on her face slowly turned serious. "What?" she asked in a raspy whisper. "I asked if you want me to kill him. I don't mind," I said, crouching down beside the low-life excuse for a man, but still holding her gaze. "Look, we can do it like this. If you want him dead, turn around, walk out of this alley, and never speak of this to anyone." "You're crazy," screeched the man from the ground. I grabbed his chin with my hand, turned his face towards mine, and squeezed. I looked right into his eyes and said, "You haven't seen crazy yet." I could feel blood draining from the holes my nails made in his skin, and I continued squeezing until I could hear the cracking of his jaw over his screams. Then I released him and let him cry some more. I looked back up at the young woman, whose color had completely drained from her face. Maybe she doesn't want him dead. Maybe she actually loves this piece of shit, I thought. As I started to stand, she stepped forward from the wall and said, "No, I'll leave." And with that, she faced the entrance of the alley and started walking. She ignored his screams and cries for help, and at the end of the alley, she stopped in her tracks and turned her head to the side to look at me from the corner of her eye. And then she faced forward and walked out of the alley and out of this life. I knew I didn't have to worry about her telling anyone anything. There are some things people just don't share in this world, and this would be one of them for her. So I didn't consume my time in thoughts with her. I looked down at the man, patted the side of his face, and said, "How'd you like to be my new science experiment?" And then he passed out. The three of us decided to take him back to Asher's, and we could try this out in the privacy of the country. We tied him up to a chain in the barn and waited for him to wake up. He finally came to after Buddy threw some water on him. "Where the hell am I?" he screamed. "Settle down," I said as I circled him and ran my fingers through his shaggy brown hair. "Should we ask him his name?" asked Buddy. Before he could answer, I cut my hand over his mouth and said, "I don't want to know it." I never ask my victims their names. And then I bent down to look at the man in the face and said, "And if you try to tell me, I'll rip your tongue out of your mouth." The man swallowed hard, but kept his mouth shut. "So, where should we start?" asked Buddy. "Well, I want to know if it's something I can control or if it's something that just happens," I said, crossing my arms in front of my chest. "Well, why don't we have you grab a hold of him the same way you did Buddy? But don't think about it. Just see if you can hold his hand and not suck anything from him," suggested Asher. I nodded in agreement and walked over to the tied-up man. I placed my hand on his arm and waited. Nothing was happening. I don't feel anything, I said. But he nodded and said, "Okay, now think about it. Think about sucking the heat out of him, or his energy." The man was starting to shake himself free from the chair. "Sit still. Don't even move an inch. This will all be over soon." Then I grabbed his arm again and concentrated. I thought hard about the warmth of his body, the energy that runs through the blood. I imagined absorbing everything from him. And then I felt it. The warmth started to creep up my arm, and slowly it flowed to my shoulder. "It's happening," I said as I looked up at the boys. "See if you can make it go faster," suggested Asher. I turned back to the man and placed one hand on each arm. I noticed a faint orange glow that was created where I put my hands. "Can you see this?" I asked them. "See what?" asked Buddy, as he and Asher came and stood next to me. "I'm seeing an orange glow where my hands are," I said, looking up at them. Then I realized their faces were kind of surprised. "We don't see an orange glow, but your eyes have turned orange. They're not gray anymore," he said. He whipped out his phone and took a picture of me. "See?" he said as he flipped the phone around to show me. I just looked at it with my mouth open. "Yeah," said Asher. Then he and Buddy backed up a few steps so I could continue our experiment. I turned back to the man and continued imagining his energy flowing into me like a fast-moving river. I envisioned Niagara Falls, and as soon as I did, I felt heat taking over my body. It was not a calm warmth like I'd gotten from Buddy and Aiden. It was a hot, burning sensation that I could feel flowing through every vein and cell in my body. I listened for the man's heartbeat. It was slowing. I pushed my mind back and concentrated on sucking everything but the blood out of him. Then, all of a sudden, I felt a snap, and I felt myself fall backwards onto the floor. I listened for the man's heartbeat. "I think he's dead," I said. I looked up at him, and sure enough, he was gone. He looked like he'd just fallen asleep. "How do you feel?" asked Buddy. "I feel different. I feel a change. I'm warmer. But it's not only that. I feel like I have this power, this extra strength. But it's a strength I've felt before when I left Romania. But now it feels enhanced," I said. "Maybe it has something to do with how you can disobey your creator's commands," said Asher. "It has to be it. Maybe you're absorbing more than just their energy. Maybe you're taking their willpower and it's making you stronger." "How would I have ever noticed it?" I asked. "Well, you probably never noticed because you were absorbing the heat while you were feeding. It would be easy to get them confused or think they are one and the same. Blood is warm, so you probably never thought twice about it. I have never really had physical contact without feeding. Aiden is the first that I've actually noticed," I said as I ran my fingers through my hair. "Maybe you're right, Asher. I've killed thousands of people in my time, and I could have been sucking their energy from them without even knowing it, and maybe it did have something to do with my own willpower," I said, but I wanted to talk to Mason about it and get his thoughts. I looked back at the man, and then at the boys. "Mind if I drain him?" I asked. "Are you going to make a mess?" asked Asher. I shook my head. "Well, all right. How's a nice midnight run sound, Bud?" he said, turning in Buddy's direction. "Sounds good to me." And then they headed off into the woods, and I was left with my meal and my thoughts.